Well, thank you very much, Kelly. I'm very grateful that you could be here with us today, and we all sort of celebrate your recent arrival with Olivia, and it was wonderful to meet her. It was a few weeks ago now with John, and it's a joyous time, and it's wonderful to have you part of our team. And the work that you've done as Parliamentary Secretary of the Treasurer, particularly in the area of housing, which I'll touch on today, has been incredibly important. And you're very kind in your comments to me, but I could say equally all of the similar things that you've said in terms of your own performance. So thank you very much, Kel. To Jim Carlton, I'm going to acknowledge Jim Carlton for a very different reason. Jim and I are part of a very small group, a very small club. We are both former state directors of the Liberal Party in New South Wales. Jim is the second longest serving director. He, like me, didn't want to set the record for the longest serving, which was Sir John Carrick, and it was about 22 years or something. And that's a life sentence in that job. And honestly, that was not anything I think you'd really aspire to. But I ranked just after Jim as the third longest serving in New South Wales, and there was this other fellow called Barry O'Farrell, who was the fourth longest serving. So we were the four members of state director roles in New South Wales that went on to be parliamentarians. So it's wonderful to acknowledge Jim here today, and it's great to see you looking so well. Of course, what you did at the Red Cross and other roles since being in Parliament is all very well known. Before I go much further today, I'm sure Kelly feels similarly. As a coalition, we had some terribly shocking news last night to learn of the passing of Don Randall. Don is a dear friend of all of us as colleagues. He is an extraordinary Western Australian. The Western Australians are a very special breed of parliamentarians. They, from both sides of the House, they are very, not that there's that many Labor members from that state, but they do have a close affinity with each other. It's a tough job coming all the way from WA to serve as a federal parliamentarian in Canberra. And to Don's wife and his family, I'm sure Kelly would agree, we really do extend our deepest sympathies. This is a terribly difficult time for his family. It's a great shock and a reminder to all of us about what is really important in life. So we remember you, Don, and we will miss you terribly. But today's topic, as John, thank you very much for your comments. It is important to lay out the rationale for why we want to do what we want to do. And as I sort of survey the landscape of the challenges that we have, what I'm seeking to do today is draw together a number of those thoughts, and having been in this portfolio now from just over 6 months, and we have already achieved quite a deal. And Kelly mentioned the reforms to the pension, and there's also the seniors supplement and other areas of defined benefit scheme payments. So there are other matters we're still continuing to pursue through the Parliament, but we are getting on with the job of fixing the budget and reforming the system and doing all of these things. But we're just getting started. There is a long way to go here, and I wanted to tell you why today. In 1989. We all remember what happened. The Berlin Wall fell. And Francis Fukuyama described these events as the end of history. Now, while this can now be seen as an excitable commentary, no doubt the sentiment actually was accurate. This was a forever world-changing event. And just as remarkable, though, as the dramatic fall of communism was the fact that its destructive force had emerged, matured, and wreaked its misery in the space of more or less just one generation. Now, this is a chilling reminder of the power of dangerous ideas in the modern world. Such threats are even more dangerous today with modern communications and the things we know well, as we have seen with extreme Islam following a very similar path. You can do a lot of damage in the space of just one generation. And thankfully, there were heroes in that generation, none less than Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who made it their life's work to tear down that wall. And they based this on an unshakable conviction that a system that crushed the human spirit and denied its potential could not stand. And it didn't. This year, though, we have witnessed the collapse of another socialist-inspired edifice of a very different kind. And this time it occurred in Greece. In just one generation, Greece has been forced to surrender their economic sovereignty. The source of their troubles can be traced back, amongst other contributing factors, to the election of the socialist PASOK government under Andreas Papandreou in 1981. PASOK ruled Greece for 19 of the next 22 years, enshrining the modern Greek age of welfare entitlement. In PASOK's first 2 years, Greece's ratio of debt to GDP increased from 21 to 32%. In 1983, the OECD said of Greece that reducing the current structural component of government borrowing is all the more urgent since in the years ahead, social transfers are projected to grow markedly. Now, the report's warnings cited as evidence large increases in pensions flowing from the significant extension of both coverage and rights, the projected ageing of the population, and planned expansions in social services expenditure. Now, instead of heeding that warning, the welfare continued to flow and the debt continued to mount. When they were defeated in 2004, debt to GDP had already eclipsed 100% on their watch and was hovering at just under that mark at the time of the election. Debt was out of control, and when the GFC hit, all of Greece's fiscal defences were down. And at the end of 2014, Greek debt to GDP was 177%. Now, no doubt the welfare measures were well-intentioned and in many cases, I'm sure, addressed some serious social injustices in Greek society. But history has proved they were unaffordable and unsustainable. This all happened in the space of 1 generation. And today, those who the Greek socialists claim would be the beneficiaries of their welfare reforms have become their victims. Drachmanomics has shut the ATMs. It's forced pensioners into the streets in tears and economically cursed at least 1 Greek generation and perhaps more. But it wasn't just the failed policies of Greece's political leaders that led Greece to this point. This didn't occur in a closed communist state. This occurred in the birthplace of democracy, with elected governments. Churchill once cheekily described democracy as the worst system of government except for all the others. And you know, democracy can guarantee an elected government, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee a good one. The Greek electorate has been complicit in its demise. It is also true that where reform attempts were made, those governments were quickly shown the door. The recent plebiscite results indicate that the Greek electorate either remains complicit or deluded. The Greek electorate wanted to believe in free money. And they're not the only ones. Welfare without cost. Because in their view, their welfare measures were right and just, and their sense of entitlement was enough to justify this. But as Hayes explains, the difference between social justice and more classical human rights is that rights demanded by social justice must be provided by someone. They're not innate. The right to a job, a fair wage, a minimum standard of living, shelter, public education, universal health care. It doesn't simply come into existence by noble proclamation. To achieve social justice requires a plan, not a placard. This is what compassionate conservatism is all about. The plan must be funded. It must be measured. It must be targeted. It must be delivered by a competent government. It must be sustainable and affordable and have the integrity necessary to sustain taxpayer confidence. And above all, there must be a strong economy to support it. The Greek experience has shown that you can live beyond your means for a while, perhaps even a generation. For a while, the consequences may not be apparent, but that is no reason for confidence. Eventually, the money runs out, and those who kept funding your habit will shut the door. The Drachmanomics experience shows you can't pay off your debts with moral virtue. Creditors prefer cash. The Greeks must now reform their economy and their welfare system from a position of profound weakness. The road ahead for Greece is difficult and bleak. Their most vulnerable will pay the biggest price. The global impact of the fiscal collapse of Greece may not be as tectonic as the fall of communism, but the warning, however distant, is still very real. And Greece has not been alone in this journey. Chancellor Merkel regularly reminds Europe it has 7% of the world's population, 25% of its GDP, and 50% of its social spending. And that if the region is to prosper in competition with emerging countries, it cannot continue to be so generous. The Chancellor's warning channels the OECD's own warning to Greece more than 30 years ago. Now in Australia, we are in a much stronger position, an economic position. Now fiscally, it's true we're not as strong, as Kelly and I only well know, as we were when Peter Costello was Treasurer, courtesy of the fiscal arsony of the Rudd government that boasted that they had brought government back, I remember this at the time of the GFC, they brought government back to the centre of the economy, like this was a good thing. However, more than 2 decades of reform, including the fact that the budget was in surplus and we had money in the bank, meant that we have been able to survive not only the GFC but a Labor government as well, and we remain relatively strong to this day. However, it is sobering to reflect on the fact that our comparative ratio of debt to GDP in 2014 was 34%. 34%. That's 13 percentage points higher than it was in Greece in 1981. So we can never think it can never happen to us. Our welfare system also remains relatively strong. It is true that it takes 8 out of 10 income taxpayers to go to work every day to pay for our $154 billion annual social services bill, and that this represents more than a third of the federal budget, and in fact it's more than twice the New South Wales state budget. However, once again, by international standards, our welfare system is measured and targeted. Now, using standard comparison data from the OECD, which takes into account other factors, our comparative figure for welfare spending as a percentage of GDP is 17% compared to 24% in Germany and 20% in the OECD more broadly. And similarly, our age pension represents 3.5% of GDP on comparative stats, which is well below the OECD average of around 7%. In Greece, it was 13%. However, it is important to note that we separate out our public welfare-based pension scheme, which is non-contributory to our private contribution-based superannuation scheme. Now, this is not the approach which is adopted in many of those other countries, as we well know, particularly in the UK. But this only serves to highlight the wisdom of the earlier reform on superannuation. Australia also leads in the world in targeting our welfare expenditure. The OECD shows that in 2010, the bottom 30% of incomes in Australia received more than 200% of the average total cash transfer across all families, compared to just 20%, around 20%, for the top 30%. Now, this level of targeting is more than 10 times greater than the average for all OECD countries, 28% more than New Zealand, 100% more than the UK, 200% more than Canada, and around 8 times more than in Germany. Now, while it is true that income support measures are highly targeted in this country, we cannot be confident that the targeting of our service delivery and programs and social services is as effective. While in static terms our welfare spending is comparatively favourable, though it is the growth in our spending that we must be careful to manage going forward. Research by the OECD reveals that despite Australia being one of the countries least affected by the GFC, our real change in working age cash income support over the 5 years to 2012-13 was higher than the OECD average at over 20%. $150 billion now. Now, this includes a doubling in expenditure on the age and disability pensions and job seeker allowance, a fourfold increase in care income support, and a 350% increase in childcare subsidies. Going forward, social services expenditure is projected to rise by 21% over the budget and forward estimates to $187 billion, an increase in annual terms of $33 billion from where it is now 4 years hence. In 10 years, the budget will hit $277 billion, growing at a nominal rate around 5.6% a year, and in real terms it's about 3.5%. This growth will be fuelled by our ageing population and the indexation of benefits to rising costs of living. However, the most significant event on the social services landscape over the next few years will be the impact of the policy decision to move forward with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That will require the single biggest increase. And by 2018-19, the Commonwealth cost will increase from less than $1 billion now to almost $20 billion in that year. And $5.2 billion of that is unfunded by the increase in the levy, and that needs to be found every single year. By 25-26, the total cost for the Commonwealth is projected to be $32 billion. Now, the NDIS is a worthy initiative, and we are committed to it. But our job is now to turn this worthy idea that others announced into something that a coalition government can actually implement and make real for those who are affected by disability and to change their futures. It's one thing to announce these things, it's much harder to implement them, and we're tasked with that responsibility. Now, we're not alone in dealing with these issues. The bottom line is we have to spend our social services budget more effectively to reduce the long-term pressures on the budget, to free up resources to target support to those who need it most, and to ensure that our safety net is sustainable. We need to spend the money better. And Liberal Conservative governments around the world, particularly in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Germany and Canada, under the banner of compassionate conservatism, are also repudiating the welfarist drachmonomics of Europe and charting a new course to sustainably help society's most vulnerable and balance the budget. This approach begins by acknowledging that the best form of welfare is a job. With a job comes choice, with a job comes independence, with a job comes the ability to frame your own future and to enliven the aspiration that is so often smothered by entitlements-based welfare. This is an agenda rooted in our sincere belief in the individual and the family as the central building blocks of our society and our economy. Since establishing the UK Centre for Social Justice in opposition, which I had the opportunity to visit when I was in opposition in the UK, Ian Duncan Smith, the now Conservative, well, he's always been a Conservative, the Conservative Minister in the now Cameron government, he's challenged Liberal Conservatives around the world to reconceive how we think about welfare and social justice and its interaction with our broader economic security policy agenda. Duncan Smith has challenged the monopoly that social democrats believe they have on compassion, but at the same time championed the role that welfare policy can have to restore individuals and families, not just break their fall. Duncan Smith's compassionate conservatism agenda was best summarised when he introduced his universal credit reforms a few years ago. He said, "A life on benefits is a poor substitute for a working life, but too much of our current system is geared towards maintaining people on benefits rather than helping them to flourish in work. We need reform that tackles the underlying problem of welfare dependency." Duncan Smith was seeking to deal with the UK at the time having one of the highest rates of children growing up in homes where no one works. And the pattern has repeated itself through the generations. In 2011, there were 613,000 plus families in Australia, jobless families. Less than 60% of lone parents in the UK back in 2013 were in employment, and that is a similar figure for Australia in 2011. This compares to 70% or more in France, Germany and the Netherlands. Duncan Smith's universal credit is all about addressing the effective marginal rate of taxation for welfare recipients as they transfer to work. Universal credit is designed to ensure that people will be consistently and unambiguously better off for each hour they work and every pound they earn, as he said. Pardon me. Universal credit draws together 6 separate payments and credits, including housing assistance, into a single payment that tapers off as a person earns more, mitigating the impact of welfare withdrawal that effectively penalises people on welfare for working. The UK government has introduced, and I like this, a cap on the total amount of benefits that most people aged 16 to 64 can receive, so that households on certain benefits can no longer receive more in benefits than the average wage for working families. That's quite a benchmark. That's a very bold benchmark to set. It introduces a new claimant commitment, setting out what is expected in return for receiving assistance. It is still early days with the introduction of universal credit, and it has its critics. And while there has been some practical issues in the implementation relating to the back-end ICT and real-time information support, the rollout has been impressive and extensive. What they've done is supported it with a real-time information link with Her Majesty's Revenue, which facilitates the taper arrangements. Now, in Australia, we already have effectively the claimant commitment, contract that is already part of our Job Active program, and we're also engaging right now, through Minister Payne, in the most significant rebuild of our payment system, the largest of its kind in the world today. This will provide the government with greater dexterity in managing income support payments and enable policy to focus more on understanding and managing what the individual and the family is receiving, rather than the siloed perspective currently defined by our ACT system of delivering just a series of separate payments. We're also moving towards the implementation of our own RTI system known as One Touch Payroll. Now, this will link up with the Australian Taxation Office and enable real-time management of family incomes rather than having to rely on the estimation method as is currently done. Where there is more work to be done, though, is the consolidation of payments, and this was recommended by Patrick McClure in his report earlier this year, where he pointed out we have 20 separate payments and more than 50 supplements in our system. It's a lot. And Patrick recommended reducing this to just 5 payments and 4 categories of supplements. This would not just make the system simpler, but it would better equip us to more effectively address the issue of effective marginal tax rates in the welfare system and remove the disincentives to work. Now, an effective and reliable safety net must catch and support the most vulnerable, and that's absolutely necessary in any scheme. But we need a safety net that acts like a trampoline, not a snare. Our welfare system must be well signposted on the way out, not just on the way in. And we need a safety net that protects and restores. In New Zealand, the key government has been delivering what I call their own 100% pure brand of compassionate conservatism to reduce long-term welfare dependency through what they call the investment approach. And that's been championed by their Finance Minister, Bill English, or Bill English, as he's known there. The investment approach, I was going to tell a Mark Textor story. He's known as Tix over there. The investment approach aims to direct the funding where it will do the most good and establish a clearer link between the application of funds and how they impact on people's risk of long-term benefits receipt. And this is an amazing system. The approach involves an annual actuarial valuation of the forward liability of the welfare system for people of working age, a multi-category appropriation which provides greater flexibility to direct funding to where it will be most effective at improving long-term employment. So this includes the ability to stop, trial and expand programs and services real-time and move funding to where it improves outcomes, removing some of the shackles that apply to much of how our social welfare expenditure is spent. And a strong accountability mechanism where performance is measured transparency as part of that actuarial model by continually assessing the future liability. The approach effectively runs the welfare system like an insurance company, where the taxpayer is paying the premiums. Its job is to successfully intervene and reduce liabilities by helping people become independent and lessen their reliance on the welfare system and hence the liability on the taxpayer in the future. Initial outcomes of the New Zealand analysis has directed the focus of the intervention to teenage youth and young female single parents in particular. While teenage recipients of benefits were found to be small in the overall scheme of things, the analysis identified that 75%, or $57 billion of the total $76 billion liability, related to beneficiaries who entered the system as teenagers. In addition, more than a third of all new youth beneficiaries were entering the system as parents, particularly females. Further analysis showed that the young people, who received the benefit in their own right at age of 16 or 17 had very high rates of contacts with the benefit system previously, 1/3 having substantiated emotional, physical or sexual abuse or neglect, and 1 in 4 having contact with the justice services in adolescence, and for young men that was more than 1 in 3. For a large proportion of youth, the path to dependency was established long before they began receiving benefits in their own right. Train had already left the station. The analysis also showed that 55% of those who were returning to claim benefits, 65% for unemployment, did so within 12 months of exiting the system, highlighting a further problem of welfare recidivism. Now, the analysis concluded that early support to youth was necessary for future long-term benefit numbers to be reduced. And for these young people, simple work placement alone would not be sufficient. Programs would need to be needed to help overcome fairly entrenched barriers to sustainable employment, and so young people could get a job and stick in a job. And there were a series of initiatives that were introduced. There was tailored case management support, transition to work grants, increased work obligations for sole parents, and they looked at this analysis and had control groups and compared it to the other beneficiaries. And from introducing those schemes, what they found in their first review and analysis after the scheme was introduced, that almost $1.8 billion was reduced in liabilities from job seekers and sole parents going off benefits, as well as lower than expected numbers coming on, and a further reduction of $2.6 billion when these results were extrapolated forward. They could measure it, they could see it, and they put money into it where it was going to make a difference. Now in Australia, we're heading in exactly the same direction. In response to the recommendation also of Patrick McClure, we have begun the work of setting up the Australian investment approach, and $20 million was allocated in the recent budget to put this in place and put the architecture and systems in place. Tendering processes are underway to select the preferred providers of these services, and we expect initial results of the analysis early in the new year, and that will frame many of our policies going forward into the next budget. This requires a focus on listening and empowering communities to respond to social challenges, and to avoid becoming what John Stuart Mill described as a people who have their faculties only half developed, as they look habitually to their government to command or prompt them in all matters of joint concern, who expect to have everything done for them. Simply paying our taxes and expecting the government to do the rest is not good enough. We cannot allow an all-encompassing state-run welfare system to anaesthetise our citizens to community, what Burke called his civil platoons. Paying taxes is the law. As citizens, as Australians, it is our natural instinct to go further. Let's not let that instinct be muffled. This generous sentiment needs to be more effectively harnessed, and social impact bonds are an area of innovation that not only empowers community engagement but also enlists private capital, private investment as well. This is where private investors provide capital and operational funding for particular community-based social programs, and they receive a dividend payment on the bond plus the principal from government, funded from the savings generated from the successful impact of the program on predefined metrics. Social impact bonds allow us to extend the financial risk of funding and delivering social services to include the private sector, not to replace, but to extend. SIBs are being used to help single mothers at risk in Canada, unemployed migrants in Belgium, the homeless in Ireland, unemployed youth in Germany, diabetics in Israel, and New Zealanders with mental health challenges. In New South Wales, the Baird government is leading the way and is conducting 3 SIB pilots in the areas of family support, child safety and recidivism. Mission Australia has partnered with Social Finance Australia to develop a social benefit bond to reduce prisoner reoffending rates. The Benevolent Society is partnering with Westpac and the Commonwealth Bank to strengthen families and reduce the need for foster care. Uniting Care Children is being supported by Social Ventures Australia to expand the existing new parent and infant network known as New PIN with $7 million for 4 additional new PIN centres, and they're achieving a 7.5% return on their funds. I anticipate that the compilation of the information base on Commonwealth welfare liabilities through the Australian investment approach will have the added benefit of enabling SIB opportunities to be more effectively evaluated at the federal level. Now, this all forms part of the broader work being done by the Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership that brings together leaders from the business and community sectors to promote philanthropic giving and investment in Australia. There's one last thing I wanted to raise today. It's not only bigger than government, but it's also bigger than any one government. Better partnerships are needed with the states and territories. Today, the Prime Minister is meeting with premiers to discuss many of the issues that challenge and confound our federation. Housing is one of those issues and is on the agenda for discussion today. It is an area where our federation is failing us. We are spending more than, together, states and Commonwealth, $10 billion a year and making very, very little progress. And that's been the case for some time. The Commonwealth accounts for around 60% of this expenditure. And in 2014-15, this equates to $6.3 billion. think there's a perception out there that the states spend all the money on housing and homelessness and things like this. It's actually the Commonwealth, and it is a predominant responsibility of the states. Now, Commonwealth Rental Assistance accounts for the majority of this investment at $4.2 billion, and the balance being transfers to the states. And the CRA has been increasing at a rate of almost 7% a year. And at the same time, state housing expenditures have been flat. There are few issues more important to ensuring the welfare of Australians than housing. Housing provides the stability and certainty needed for individuals and families to deal with the many challenges they face. Unemployment, the breakdown of relationships, a place to care for those you're caring for, a place of refuge from violence, and the list just goes on. It is also the principal source of wealth for most families. Australians hold more than $5 trillion in real estate and dwelling assets. You will find housing failures at the centre of most social service challenges. It's either the cause or the consequence. 2/3 of Australians either own or are paying off their home. The balance is in rental accommodation, and almost half of those are receiving some form of housing benefit. Despite the best efforts of many on both sides of politics, all well-intentioned, more than 100,000 Australians remain homeless today. Hasn't changed. For those seeking to buy their own home, the price has more than doubled the increase in wages over the past 25 years. And that's average across the country. Obviously, in my hometown of Sydney, it's much stronger than that, but equally here in Melbourne, as we've seen more recently. And go back a few years and Perth was going through something very similar. More than 30% of family income is now required to meet median loan repayments. Now that breaches one of the many housing affordability threshold indices. The ratio of owner-occupied housing debt to disposable income is now more than 90%, and that's up from 55% in December 2000. The supply of housing, as Kelly has articulated so well, is simply not keeping up with demand. While record low interest rates is extending credit to more home purchases, the lack of stock is forcing up prices. Fortunately for renters, wages and rents have moved largely at a similar pace to wages and rents as a proportion of gross household income, and they remain well below the 30% affordability threshold. Now in Australia, private rental accommodation is supported by a large pool of mum and dad investors making private rental stock available through negative gearing. By number, almost 80% of these investors are middle-income Australians earning $80,000 a year or less, and they own just one property on average. They are school teachers, police officers, nurses, and office workers saving and investing to provide for their financial security. You'd think the way some people go around about negative gearing, that apparently these people are the problem. These people are the solution. They're saving, they're investing, they're providing for themselves. They may not at lower levels of income because their incomes are lower, the actual value of the tax deduction is less, but in number, they are the majority. Working Australian families trying to get ahead, and in doing so, creating a pool of rental properties that are there for people to rent in that part of the market. Now, the difference between our market and those overseas is in overseas, particularly in Europe and the US less so, but that area is taken up by institutional investors. That doesn't happen here. So who would you rather be bidding against at an auction? A mum and dad investor or the AMP? I think negative gearing gets a bad rap, and I think it's important we stand up for those who are trying to provide for their future. For more than 1 million households relying on Commonwealth rental assistance, while the costs have sharply risen for the taxpayer, the indexation to CPI has meant a widening gap between the level of support and the cost, particularly in our large cities. Social housing stock is static at around 400,000 units. Commonwealth rental assistance supports over about 1.2 million families. Social housing stock is at 400,000 and has just been stuck there for years. The only real change has been internal transfers from public housing to community housing stock. And affordable housing initiatives, well, they've had very mixed success. The Western Australians have done quite well, but very few are able to scale up to the level of supply needed to make a real difference at a sustainable level of taxpayer support. The NRAS scheme, while promising much, cost 150% higher per unit than social housing and CRA. Well-intentioned, but just didn't make the grade. I commend the Prime Minister for putting this issue on the agenda with the states and territories. We could just say it's all the states' fault and leave it with them. But you know, that leaves us with a very big problem if they fail. We must address this in a holistic way, not by just portioning out the social housing side of the market and the private market factors separately. The full list of interconnected issues must be on the table for this discussion between the Commonwealth and the states. This means land release planning, regulation reform, infrastructure provision, seniors downsizing incentives, transaction taxes, management and financing of social housing stock, the interface between the CRA and wraparound services that transition people from homelessness to independent housing. That's just to name a few. There is also a need to understand how housing assistance impacts on effective marginal tax rates when combined with other income support measures that can work against making people and families more independent. We simply cannot continue the current failed one-way traffic of shoveling money out to the states for social housing with no accountability for outcomes or integration with broader policy measures that impact the entire housing market. For the federal government, such an approach means that the federal taxpayer ends up paying to deal with the same problem twice, because a housing policy failure at the state level only compounds the income support response at the federal level, which is then required. To borrow a phrase from Bill English, the approach just services misery rather than relieving it. But there are examples of how things can be done as a way to guide us. Last week I was in Perth at a project called Foyer Oxford, which was run by Anglicare. And they brought together federal and state governments, the local community housing organisation, the local TAFE, and $1 million from BHP in philanthropy to create 98 accommodation units to transition young homeless Australians in Perth to long-term accommodation. The building is an oasis of stability where young people can make good decisions, get themselves sorted out into education and employment and move on. The success rate at transfers into long-term accommodation is 80%. Apart from the obvious nature of this success, what makes this project even more important is that it deals with one of the other great weaknesses in our welfare system, which is transience. Transient disadvantage caused by the loss of a job or an escape from domestic violence. Transient disadvantage caused by an accident or illness while you restore your capability. Transient withdrawal from work due to caring responsibilities in the knowledge that one day you will have to return. For the majority of Australians, our goal must be for the welfare system to be a transit stop, not a destination. We must deal with the changing circumstances of life and the disruptions that can take place more effectively than we do today. Our compassionate, conservative view of a future positive welfare system is one that is more effective, more restorative, more reliable, more sustainable, more accountable, more innovative, engaging and more flexible. It's better targeted, and ultimately that means a lesser proportion of the population dependent on the system. In Greece, they showed how getting it wrong on welfare for a generation could destroy their economy. Equally, we can demonstrate how getting it right on welfare for a generation can have the opposite effect. Thank you for your attention.